Hey everyone, we want to welcome you back for another one of our live streams with Determined Truth. This live stream is going to be kind of unique in so many ways. We've been doing a series on Israel, Palestine, and Israel, Gaza. We've been doing series on the end times. We've been doing series on the church and politics. And this one's going to kind of fit in a number of different parameters there. But a number of years ago, I was reading a book that was just really formative for me called The Patient Ferment of the Early Church. It kind of discussed how Christianity gained influence in the early centuries. And simply put, it said that Christians were known as people who loved their neighbors. They were kind, they were generous. Well, it turns out that such behavior has continued to be modeled in the Middle East today, and it's impacting tens of thousands of Muslims, and some of whom you won't believe. So to learn more about that, we've invited Scott Gustafson. I'm not sure I'm going to say your name correctly, Scott.
There's a lot of consonants there.
There you go.
Yeah.
Gustafson. So Scott has extensive experience in the Middle East as a practitioner and consultant with faith-based charities and churches and humanitarian relief and mission work. He earned his PhD in religion and theology from Freie Universität. I think I said that somewhat correctly, Scott. You can correct me if you need to. Researched religious conversion phenomena among former Muslim refugees in the Levant and the de-radicalization of some violent extremists among them. He's a member of the Extreme Beliefs and Strong Religion Working Group at the Freie Universität, funded by the European Research Council. He's the Ambassador Warren Clark Fellow at Churches for Middle East Peace. He earned his MA in Intercultural Studies in the Middle East Studies from Moody Graduate School and a BA in Nursing and Biology from Western Michigan University. And he studied Arabic at the University of Jordan. Scott advises large funding agencies as well as indigenous organizations in the Middle East. He's an advocate for peace, and he speaks to groups about missions, Islam, and the Middle East, and countering extremism and radicalism. He runs a nonprofit cycling team as well. Scott and his wife have two children, and they live in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Scott, welcome, and thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, guys. Yes. Pleasure to be here. Appreciate the opportunity.
Well, it's great to have you here. Why don't we begin by just having you tell us some more about yourself and your work, kind of how you got into all that, and just give us a little bit of bio background and how God's led you to the point where you are now.
Sure. Yeah. As you can tell from the long reading that Rob just did, it's been quite a journey. Started in the medical field as a nurse, worked in an emergency room, felt a strong call as my wife and I were dating into missions. And we started raising funds to go to the Middle East prior to 9/11. And I can remember the day I was in Best Buy shopping for a TV, seeing the Twin Towers on all these monitors.
Oh, wow.
And just kind of embarrassed, like, what am I doing here? And worried about, like, should we even be doing what we're doing? So that was kind of our entree into the Middle East. We did move with young kids and spent about a decade there doing humanitarian work, mission work, got into businesses, mission stuff, and then started consulting with some of the funding agencies that were empowering national organizations and national churches, which was very exciting. Around the Syrian and Iraq war and all the refugee movement that happened, things just got really interesting. Started hearing testimonies of Muslims coming to faith and extremists that were out to harm the church, join the church. And that began kind of an interest in exploring what I ended up studying for my PhD and interviewing a bunch of those guys and gals. It was such a privilege to get to know them and understand how the church embodied the virtues of Christ in a very difficult context and the fruit that came out of that. So that's the journey in a nutshell, I guess.
Wow. So tell us a little bit more then about that work in the Middle East, specifically like what you were doing, and then how you started coming across these Muslim Muslims who started coming to faith in Christ.
Yeah, so it's interesting. Whenever I say like partnering with the indigenous church, some people are like, "There's a church in the Middle East," which there has been for a couple thousand years, and
it's called this Jesus story thing.
The some of them trace their direct spiritual lineage to the apostles, and it's fascinating to hear some of the churches of the East, especially. So the organizations that I had worked with, a couple different foundations, were funding primarily evangelical work that was doing relief and development in the context of the refugee crisis. So it was really cool, like informal education programs, feeding programs. Hydroponics was another one that was super cool. There was a car import-export business that was trying to generate funds for refugees. There was a recycling business that employed a bunch of refugees. So all these cool things. And in the context of all that, these Christians were bearing witness through their good deeds. And in a lot of the countries I was working in, evangelism in the kind of like caricature that we think of, standing on a street corner and shouting or something, is totally illegal and nobody does it. And they bear witness, much like you referenced Patient Ferment of the early church. They bore witness, much like the early church did, as a persecuted minority through their deeds, through their patience, through their love, through their kindness, through their hospitality, through their posture as a minority. And it was really cool. As we were kind of in the midst of that work, people started coming to faith, and not just a few. I mean, like if I compare the first 10 years of my work, I could count on one hand people that would, accept Christ, especially from a Muslim background. It was just pretty, status quo. Yeah. But as time went on and refugee movement happened, there are some statistics that indicate 40,000 just in the Levant have converted Christianity from various other backgrounds in the last 8 or 9 years. So pretty significant movement, and quite a number of extremists, even some that fought for jihadist organizations and such in that context. So as I was working, started to hear some of the stories, meet people, and just became very interested in understanding how and why and what in the world happened in your story and how did God work in your life.
Interesting. Wow. Now, when we think of radical ISIS, you're talking about members of ISIS and members of some of these radical terrorist groups. Yeah. Describe for us a little bit about who they are, because we kind of have a caricature of what a member of ISIS might be like, but there's a story behind their radicalism and everything else as well. So kind of give us an idea of the people whom we're talking about.
Yeah. So it might be good. Like I can give you some data points and then tell a story maybe. Both of those kind of help. I think our character most of the time is like this theologically motivated, violent, very strong kind of personality sort of individual. And what we find in the research, one French researcher of terrorism, jihadism, says they don't give a damn about theology. Direct quote.
Wow.
Most of them, and I found this true in my interviews, were more caught up in the belonging, the adventure, the need for significance, defending the honor of their family, their country, their tribe, feeling these grievances about the state of the world and the state of their country, the state of their family, be it poverty or politics or access to water, lots of different issues like that. The felt kind of assault on Islam and their country from the West, thinking it was kind of a Christian crusade again. George Bush at one point even used that term. So it just reinforces a lot of their kind of image. So there's lots of grievances in there and lots of sociology, lots of psychology. It really has little to do with theology for most of them. That would come later. And so I found actually the same, we'll get to that in a minute, in their de-radicalization and conversion process, that the initial steps were much more about belonging and relationships and sociology and psychology than they were about theology and cognitive belief, if you will. So one guy, for example, was a militia leader and also a tribal elder in Syria. And at one point, like the country was torn into all these factions. And two different factions, ISIS and the Syrian government, were trying to get he and his tribe to ally with them. And he refused. He didn't want to participate. And so he's being attacked from both sides, threats from both sides. His kids were constantly under threat of being kidnapped. And so he bore arms, fought, killed people, the whole thing. And so we picture in our minds this like militant Islamic extremist, but this guy was just trying to defend his clan. I'm not justifying anything he did. I'm just trying to paint the context that it wasn't so much a religious or theological motivation. It was much more of a family allegiance, if you will, or tribal allegiance that motivated him primarily. So that gives you a little bit of a flavor of kind of a story and some of the research that happens there.
I want to pick up just on something you listen. You gave a litany of these contributing factors. One is very that I really enjoy exploring to try to understand better. And you just mentioned this whole idea of honor and shame. Yeah. That's so little a part of American culture. I don't think most of us believers or Christians here in our country understand the power and the nature of the honor-shame dynamic in some of these cultures and how it impacts all kinds of things. I wonder if in that you could pick up that just a little bit and talk about how that's entered into the picture here.
Sure. Yeah, I think that most cultures of the world have some percentage of the honor-shame dynamic. It's often positioned against this when we're talking about spiritual things or redemption or salvation, the guilt or innocence dynamic.
Right.
And in the West, we tend to conceptualize the gospel, for example, as being guilty and then being declared innocent through the work of Christ. A much more resonant theme in spiritual conversations in the East, especially in the Middle East, is this dynamic of honor. And David in the Psalms talks about this: you covered my shame and you lifted my head, and all of these kind of images that resonate with Bedouin Arab culture. But that dynamic is very, very dominant in the Middle East, and especially in Islam. And so it not only affects kind of our religious conceptualizations, but how we treat one another. It's why Middle Easterners, one of the reasons anyway, they're famous for hospitality. If any of you have been to a Middle Eastern home, you know that there's great honor shown to guests. They dote on their guests. It's a fabulous experience being a recipient of hospitality there. So those are just some examples. That dynamic is very, very strong. And so I mentioned like the need for significance is kind of a psychological term that one guy named Ari Kruglansky uses a lot to describe this quest for significance or honor. And so we all have it, men or women, and where we find that significance or honor often is a motivator for our actions and our thoughts and our allegiances and the groups we join. So it's a big deal that you're right. It's easy to overlook in the West because it's a kind of smaller percentage normally. Right. But we do see it here in the West too. I think Southern culture has more honor and shame dynamics than maybe Northern or Midwestern culture. So you see that play out in different parts of the country here even.
Yeah. Interesting. So what is it then that, I mean, it's just hard to imagine somebody being a member of ISIS and suddenly becoming a Christian, because if the whole idea of it is that they're drawn to radicalism was because of a rejection of the Western incursions, which are challenging their faith or challenging their culture, challenging their value systems, that they would somehow then come to embrace what seems to be the embodiment of the Western world, and that is Christianity.
Sure. Yeah, that's one of the cool things that I think the Middle Eastern Church teaches us. And man, does this speak to our current kind of Western political situation, that Christianity does not equal Hollywood and the West and social media and all of that kind of stuff. So in many Middle Easterners' mind, especially when we first got there, they would equate those things. But seeing the Middle Eastern Church live out of a very pragmatic faith, again, that's very similar to how the early church conceptualized their role in society. We're here to serve. You're welcome in our midst. There was an idea of belonging was offered first before you tried to convince someone of your theological concepts. And so you've heard of the 3Bs kind of, I don't even know what that's called, framework, I guess, believing, behaving, belonging. Yeah. It's a really helpful way to understand how people come to faith and what a church or a body of believers of any kind of faith does to attract people, if you will. And belonging always came first in their stories.
Okay. I was going to say, flesh that out, because a lot of our listeners or viewers might not understand, because in the West, we typically think that belief has to come first.
Yeah.
So explain that.
Yeah, no, this is super important. And I think this is shifting. For a long time, you guys may recall, like me, going through like a class on mission or something, like, here's how you present the gospel, and there's the 4 spiritual laws or the bridge diagram or something like that. You approach it with belief. So it kind of, in the words of one philosopher, approaches people like heads on toothpicks. Like you're talking to the brain. But people are holistic, very rounded people with emotions, thoughts, needs for social structures. And what we find in almost all conversion research is people don't change their minds first. They change their relationships. They change their places of belonging. So behavior then flows out of that. So, you know, if you're trying to target a behavior like extremism or violence, you can't go directly to the behavior or directly to belief. They need to feel a sense of belonging first. And all of them describe that. So as they came to faith, it was a long process, most of them 2 to 3 years of associating with Christians. Their kids were welcomed into school. They started visiting other Christians. Most of them for the first time had never met a Christian before. And so they're getting involved in relationships, seeing, wow, these people do life way different. And if I need help, I know where I'm going to go. And even if they don't have very much money, and I have a medical need, I know they'll help me. And
this is happening in the refugee camps.
Yep, that's right.
All right.
Yeah. And so you see that sort of lived out. There wasn't this string attached, like, here, you have to come to this Bible study and pray to receive Jesus, and then we'll help you with your medical issue.
Right.
Yeah.
There wasn't much of that going on, those kind of more coercive attempts to change belief first. So I found that very eye-opening.
Wow.
It's fascinating. In that, it's interesting because you're talking about the belonging sense. Another person that we've interviewed a while back was a pastor in Phoenix area named Caleb Campbell, and he's done a lot of research on Christian nationalism and how to talk about that with people. And it's this fascinating stuff. He talks about a missiological approach, which has a lot to do with understanding their context, and there was a very strong sense of the belonging part, even in that culture as well. Yeah. These people that understand me, they get me, that we have each other's back. We're in this, and then it grows into this larger thing. It's interesting how that works in a lot of different arenas. We find that those dynamics playing out.
Yeah. You reminded me of something too that one of the pastors told me. Doctorate in textual studies and Aramaic. I mean, this guy's brilliant. And he said, you know what mission is for us? It's sitting at the feet of a Syrian refugee and listening to their story.
Wow.
That's it. You sit and you listen, and you don't argue with them about doctrine or Islam or any of that stuff.
Or contend against the things that they say that are wrong and correct them.
Yeah.
Wow.
Or ask them, did you fight in the conflict? Like, are you a violent extremist? Are you a terrorist? No, like you sit and you listen to their story. And what often comes out first is the heartache and the terrible things they've been through and the people they've lost and the great drama of their life story in getting to their host country, whether it was Lebanon or Jordan or Northern Iraq or something. And man, your heart just aches for them. And you start to understand their context. And over time, you earn the right to share what you think and what you believe. But that's not the first step in those contexts at all. Yeah.
Okay. So some of the things that drew them to Christianity then was simply the behavior, the conduct, the community of the Christians there as well. But is there not a role in a lot of these stories and a lot of these experiences of the supernatural, like dreams?
Yes. Yeah.
Doesn't that have a big part in that in that part of the world?
Yeah, so it was pretty interesting as I started doing I did an ethnographic study, so lots of interviews, and then you can kind of gather some data from that. So in most studies of conversion from Islam, there's a couple large ones. Dreams and visions played a big role. So somewhere between 40, 50, 60% of people that convert to Christianity from Islam have some kind of supernatural experience. It's often repeated in groups of 3. It's a man in white speaking words of peace that makes them feel incredibly welcome and makes them very curious about who this person is. Most of them haven't ever read the Bible before that, so it stimulates kind of an interest. In my study, 83% of those that came to faith from an extremist background had some kind of dream or vision or supernatural kind of thing happen to them. Lots of them had answered prayers after their conversion. Many of them had repeated experiences like this. So it is a very common thing in their culture. So in Islamic culture, dreams there's even a whole procedure for praying for a dream in the night if you want guidance from Allah. So this is not foreign to their kind of religious experience. But in the conversion to Christianity, it is a very common thing to hear of dreams and visions. So often, even some of those in ministry would say, have you had a dream? Or have you had God answer a prayer in a miraculous way? Like, we would never ask that question. It's a little awkward. Like, if I asked you, Rob, when's the last time? What was your last dream? Like, that's a little
right.
weird, but not there. It's very, very common. Yeah.
Wow. So tell us some of the stories of some of the people that you met then, because you're talking about your doctoral research on this topic. Kind of give us some stories of some of these individuals and their backgrounds and their stories.
Sure. Yeah, a couple kind of stand out to me as special. I told one of this militia leader. He actually became a good friend. We keep in touch, and I've visited his home. The hospitality is kind of amazing. His kids are around the table. I've brought my family there. He just has a really amazing story of going from a very, very wealthy, influential, powerful person with bodyguards and cars and houses all over the place, caravans and armored escorts and all of that kind of thing, and now lives in a 2-bedroom apartment as a refugee. And he has been brought so low by this whole experience, but tells everyone he meets, he pastors a small congregation now too, that he wouldn't trade it for the world.
Wow.
He knows Jesus. He's helping others, many of them from his background, come to understand who Jesus is and inviting them into this community. He has such a joy on his face. So that's one story. Another that was just crazy to me, there was a Sharia sheikh. So he's an elder in Islamic law. And he was given responsibility as a judge in the Islamic State. So he served in Syria on like a tribunal, if you will, military tribunal type of thing. So one guy got in trouble. I don't remember what the crime was, but came before him. They declared him guilty, and he was declared or sentenced to death. So they went to execute him, which was fairly common, by firing squad, and none of the guns would fire. So he tells me this story. I'm like, come on. He said, no, we tried like multiple guns. We had an AK. We tried that. We loaded different ammunition. It wouldn't go off. We'd fire it into the ground. It would fire fine, but it wouldn't like fire.
Really?
Wow. So we tried a pistol. That didn't work.
They didn't decide to like put the guy in the ground.
Yeah, exactly. So then he was like nonchalantly, so we cut his head off. And I like just my eyes are like this, listening to the story, as we'd all be. It's very dramatic. And he says that was the turning point for him, because that night he had terrible nightmares of blood dripping from the ceiling and this impending sense of doom. And he's like, I did something wrong. I did something very wrong. And he started talking about it with the other judges. And of course, they were suspicious of him then because he wasn't towing the party line. And they were like, you can't question this anymore. And he talked about it with his, military group, and they were like, you can't do this anymore. So they eventually threatened him, like, you can't start questioning the tribunal or ISIS or whatever it is. So he fled. He ran. He came to a neighboring country as a refugee, settled in a tent, and he got to know a Christian group that was giving out food. And that began a journey with some from that community. They eventually learned his story and loved him anyway. And he now preaches in church.
Wow.
It's crazy. I mean, that did not happen overnight. The journey from a executioner to a preacher, that takes a little while.
Yeah.
But amazing story. Numerous stories like that. Another gal, I could go on all day. So
please, go ahead.
Go ahead.
There's another lady who harbored Islamic State militants in her home. And one day she remembers they were on her roof firing at Syrian military jets. And the jets circled back and dropped bombs on her family home while she was across the street with her daughter, and everybody died. They all were incinerated at that moment. So she has one kid left, huge family, extended family, parents, husband, sibling. They're all dead. And so she takes her kid and walks to a neighboring country, finds a refugee community, is totally destitute, accepts food from these Christians who are doing a food package program. They come to visit her and follow up and find that she needs a mattress. So they bring her some articles for her home. They offered to enroll her kids in school. They eventually invite her to a home Bible study sort of thing, and they offer to pray for her. And they welcome her into their community gradually, just observing her needs, having compassion, hearing her story. And she came to faith and now is a part of the church. And a lot of these folks, like you hear these dramatic stories, and I'm condensing, years of trauma really into a very short clip here. But they not only like receive these benefits from participating in community, like tangible things like food, clothing, shelter, all of that, but they receive intangible benefits of relationship and solace and someone to listen, and they are able to process their trauma. And in that context of compassion, empathy, they heal. So it's not just a spiritual awakening, but it's an emotional, a mental health experience for them. And many of the ministries have run all of their people doing various programs through trauma healing training. They've equipped them as basic level counselors, if you will. So it's really interesting to see how all of that comes together, this holistic approach to how are we going to care for our neighbors. It's not, in the Middle Eastern church's mind, many of them, it's not about evangelism. Like, that's not where they start. They're just like, we're the church, we're supposed to be Jesus, and we see these needs. So what are we going to do about it? And that's a fascinating way to approach mission that's very similar to the early church. There's a few stories for you.
Oh, great.
Now,
go
ahead, Danny.
I was going to say, and maybe we'll get to this later, but one of the threads that keeps going through my head is, what are some of the things, besides what you described, that American Christians just don't get about this, about the Middle East? Because I think that's a part of one of the things that Rob and I are trying to do through all of this is not only educate ourselves, but our audiences. We have a very narrow view of so many things, the church, the kingdom, all this kind of stuff. And we tend to see, we have an adversarial viewpoint toward most of these people.
Right.
They're part of, quote, the enemy, whatever, however you might define it. It might be broader or narrower in that definition, but in some sense, there's an adversarial view of this. But just in general, what have you learned that you wish that the American church could grasp about all this?
Oh man, I could write a whole nother book on that.
Okay. Do the introduction now.
Here, I'll wing it. I'll wing the introduction.
Okay.
I think a couple things come to mind. We have a really messed up perspective on how people change. We think by our behavior anyway, we think people change by confrontation, argument, hostile action, shaming them into changing, confronting, all of that kind of stuff, the more direct power plays. And the research just seems to indicate people don't change on any front, whether they're changing intellectual thought or behavior in those methods. It reminds me of the Anglican theologian Robert Capon. He talks about left-handed and right-handed power, and Jesus is in the parables advocating for left-handed power, the power of persuasion, love, kindness. It's a weak power, not the power of retribution, violence, force. And I think our context in the West is so much about power politics. We're just enamored with people with power and celebrities and money and those with huge platforms. And that's our context for how things change. And it's just not the way the kingdom works. So seeing the Middle Eastern church, for example, exist in a place of weakness and use, for example, glory in their weakness and their ability to sit at the feet of a refugee and hear their story. It should be a very powerful testimony to us in the West as to, if we want to change our context, what does that look like? Well, the ways of Jesus, the virtues that he advocated for and passed down to the church, and that the church fathers taught and lived out in their similar context to the Middle East today, I think those are unchanging. I mean, those ought to be the traits that we're known for. And so many Christians in the West have gotten enamored with being in power, whether that's politics or wealth or whatever the case is. So that's a big one, I think.
That's huge. And we're going to be doing a number of live streams in the upcoming months. I have one coming up Thursday night, which will be July 11th at 5 p.m. Pacific, kind of discussing this kind of avenue here of power and the corrupting influence of the power as contrasted with the gospel. And the gospel's denial of power. Jesus suffers violence, whereas nations inflict violence there. Also, so now
It's also
go ahead, Danny.
Before you jump on I was just like, also in the Western context, because theological correctness is something that we demand, even when it comes to conversion. You got to understand, even if we simplify it down to the 4 spiritual laws, there's something about these are correct ideas that you have to sit. And then those ideas become a weapon of power. You believe the right things. I have the truth. You don't have the truth. Let me correct you on the truth. It seems like that's also a part of what goes on here. So I think some of the fears that people have, if you do this whole relationally, whatever, where does the quote unquote truth come through? Because we're so locked into, we have to make sure we get the theological truths correctly stated. Yeah. How does that work in this dynamic you're talking about?
Yeah, that is a whole really important area. I think we have this kind of idea, again, back to that believing, behaving, belonging paradigm, that belief is the primary thing. So the correct belief, the correct doctrine. And I think the Middle Eastern church would say, actually, I think love is the indicator of spiritual maturity, and not necessarily correct doctrine or belief or memorizing facts even. There's a whole kind of movement now in spiritual formation that's really lovely to see that resurge. Like, our lives ought to actually look like Jesus. That's the measure of a disciple. It's not if we can recite all of these even memory verses or systematic theological concepts. So that's super important. I think that kind of goes hand in hand with the right-handed power versus left-handed. If we know things, the adage knowledge is power. There's something there with that if we're correct, if we stand on the truth, even though our behavior is deplorable, then we're okay. We're in the right.
Right.
And those things, the powerful testimony happens when those things match, when our behavior matches our belief. There's a really neat instruction from the Middle Eastern church there too.
Wow. I was going to ask, what kind of adversities do these men and women face, having come from an Islamic background or even a radicalized background? Now, obviously, they're in a refugee camp. They might be somewhat protected, but do they face repercussions for embracing Christianity, and how does that dynamic work?
Yeah, from 2 fronts, well, 3 maybe even. Many of them committed violent acts in the past, and so they're either wanted by the Syrian government, by the militia they left, or they're wanted by their host government. So some of them spent time in prison in all of those places. One of them, I went back recently, who I had interviewed a couple of years ago, and he was in prison. His acts caught up with him. Others are also in trouble as a result of their, so that's like their actions in the past catching up with them. So they're at a disadvantage there. Many of them can't get resettled as refugees because of their actions in the past. So another guy who participated with Islamic State, he was a recruiter, was given a denial letter by a Western country saying, we're not going to resettle you because of your past. That's understandable. And then after conversion, when families, militia groups, clans, whatever, learn of this, of course, most of them are not very happy about it. None of them seem to be afraid of that, honestly. One guy out of all of them, now many of these are a year, 2 or 3 on in their journey of conversion, but only one guy seemed fearful to me. The rest are saying, no, we need to share our faith with our family members. We share very openly. We invite them. We say, come, participate with us. Let us take you to church. Let us introduce you to where you can get help with your kids or whatever it is. So many of them are very bold. In fact, there's one church that's pastored by one of these former extremists that's filled with former extremists. And he's like, these are my people. This is who I'm called to reach. I'm like, I'm glad it's you, man, because that wouldn't be very effective. So yeah, they face consequences. Many of them have had their homes broken into, had to move a lot. One of them had their dog killed. I mean, there's just constant threats. So they do deal with those consequences. And then there's kind of the legal and procedural issues that come. So their kids, and if they convert, have a very difficult time with civil issues like marriage or burial. So if they've left their community of faith and the cemeteries are owned by Sunni, Shia, Druze, or Christian, where are they supposed to bury their dead? And how do they get married to someone who, say, either also converts from a Muslim background or is from a Christian background when their ID says Muslim, Sunni, or Shia?
Oh,
So they can't do that. It's illegal. So there's lots of complicated status issues like that, in addition to the persecution, threats of death, all of that kind of thing.
now, do they identify as Christian or as Muslim background believers or followers of Jesus? How do they self-identify?
Yeah, I think, I mean, everybody's a little different in how they phrase it, even based on the context. So a lot of them would just say, I'm a follower of Jesus. Because as you pointed out in the beginning, to say I'm a Christian, that's got a lot of baggage with like, okay, does that mean you're a Zionist? Does that mean you support Israel? Does that mean you're like, involved with sexual promiscuity and all the stuff we see on TV? What does that mean? So that raises questions that it answers. Yeah.
Okay. So what are they? So there's just it varies.
It varies. Most of them would say followers of Jesus. And I think a lot of them prefer to be, like, if we're going to give them a label, say they're a believer from a Muslim background. Yeah.
Muslim background
is kind of the term that's used a lot in evangelical mission culture. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Right. Very good. Okay. I just lost the question I was going to ask. Let me think again. Go ahead if you have something, Danny.
Well, at some point, I think we want to. I'm curious how this plays into what's going on now in Israel and Gaza.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Yep.
Yeah, sure. There's been a lot of time on this ministry talking about that. Rob he could talk about it himself. He's got a long history of working in that area. So how do you see some of these dynamics playing out in that arena? Right. What should we as American Christians know based on your research and what you've been doing about what's going on there? How do we respond to that and think about that?
Yeah, I think a lot of these dynamics, as you can tell, are kind of stitched up into the Israel-Palestine conflict. Our Western perspective, we want to play the power card and defeat the enemy and confront the enemy and all of that. But I think it does go back to how do human beings change? Behaviors, beliefs, alliances, all of that kind of stuff. And it rarely is because of militaristic, retributive violence. Rarely. That has been shown even in the extremism terrorism research to just result in more. One of the interesting caveats, this doesn't have much to do with Israel, Gaza, but Guantanamo Bay, the prison, has been shown to have produced more extremists than it actually housed there.
Interesting.
Wow.
That was a really, point of contention for Islamic extremists all over the globe. So that's just one small example. There's lots of studies about Israel-Palestine in particular, that when Israel responds over the top, disproportionate with home demolitions and collective punishment, that actually results in more terrorist attacks in the future. It doesn't solve them. So I think Christians have an interesting voice in conflicts like this that can advocate for nonviolence. We have a long history of that can also advocate for more humane, holistic approaches to conflict. And there's a long tradition of just peacemaking. So often I hear in this kind of thing, well, they have a right to self-defense.
Right.
Or just war theory you hear brought up. Just war theory, of course, has its merits and the long history there, but that was not part of the early church's posture towards anything for the first 400 years. That came about in the 5th century. And the early church would disagree wholeheartedly with the use of violence, full stop. So I think our testimony is really injured as the church when we advocate for hostility, even towards enemies. That was a clear directive of Jesus. And I think our moral contribution to conflicts like this is to come to creative solutions. So my question would be, like, after my research, actually the initial retributive kind of responses that have now resulted in tens of thousands of civilians that have died. I wonder how many of those have been sort of brought to the Israeli viewpoint. Like, I mean, it seems like a silly question to ask. And from the Hamas perspective, like, how many of the Israelis that they kidnapped or the families are now sympathizing with Hamas as a result of the kidnapping? Violence just begets more violence.
Yeah.
And so I wonder what would be a different approach. What could Christians from this just peacemaking approach, like, what might we say? How could we address, for example, the causes of the conflict to begin with? and address those
Exactly.
grievances in a wise way? What if we responded, and I mean the global sort of community, even our own country, with investments in humanitarian infrastructure, school, education, all of the things that are lacking? I mean, economics alone is drastically different between the West Bank and Gaza and Israel. But those grievances have to be addressed somehow. And I think that's a voice Christians can have. And it does just trouble me when our knee-jerk response, especially as Christians in the West, is the logic of the state. Our knee-jerk is just war, defense, the logic of government and state, instead of the logic of Jesus, the logic of the kingdom, which is left-handed weakness. And it's difficult.
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, it's hard when, I get into a scuffle or an argument with a coworker or a neighbor or my family to maintain that posture, but let alone on a scale like that.
Yeah.
But it is possible. We've seen the church witness to this and model it through the centuries in different circumstances. And I think that is the unique contribution that Jesus wants from us as we incarnate in our time and space now. So I would really wish, and have been praying and working towards peaceful solutions. There are many voices out there. They don't get airtime in the Israel-Gaza conflict. But you see, for example, enemy combatants on either side meeting together and trying to find peaceful solutions. These things do happen.
Yeah, they do.
There are Christians advocating for peace in the midst of it.
Yeah, thank you.
Wow. Fantastic. Anything else that you think we should address or cover? I mean, this is fantastic. I thank you for your time and your work and for helping us understand this. And as I said before, we're going to be addressing some of these things on live streams up and coming, because I think the Western churches have been inundated with a false propaganda that leads us away from Christ-likeness and the Christianity that was founded instead of there. But anything we missed or that you want to add?
Oh man, yeah, I think I'm excited. Actually, we were talking as a group of friends over the 4th holiday about the coming elections and the Israel-Gaza crisis. There's all this stuff going on in the world, but when crisis and chaos are kind of happening, I think it is a chance. It's an opportunity for the church to be the hands and feet of Jesus, to incarnate his ways and his virtues in our time and space. And oh man, that's my prayer too, like you guys, to see the church live that out, both in context in Israel-Palestine right now, in Lebanon and Jordan, in Iraq, as churches have been doing in the refugee crisis, but us in our context, that our voice might be a little bit different than the voice around us. It's interesting, like there's lots of good thinking and leadership and examples of that out there, but man, it's not what gets held up today as Christian or as evangelical. And I think those of us with the opportunity to tell those stories, like I have today about the church in the Levant, the early church story and how they dealt with persecution, we need to revisit those stories.
Amen. Amen.
Sure.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate it. So we want to encourage you, if you've been watching, to like this channel, subscribe to the YouTube channel, leave a comment as well, and share it with others. All helps us get the word out more effectively. And so Scott, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you all. Appreciate the opportunity and your interest.
Yeah, that's great. All right.